Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. It was just after sunrise when I started the drive. The sky over the Mojave had that pale, washed-out look it gets before the heat builds up. Pink light bleeding into the dusty horizon, the air already bone-dry. My truck hummed steadily as I merged onto the long stretch of highway that cut through miles and miles of desert. It always amazed me how empty it felt out there. Just asphalt and sand and the occasional creosote bush. Everything stretched flat until the mountains rose like faded shadows in the distance. I had 6, maybe 7 hours of driving ahead of me before I'd reach the base, so I called my wife to keep myself company. We did that often. She'd still be in her pajamas, coffee steaming beside her. Our dog probably curled up at her feet. It made the miles go by faster, hearing her talk about small things back home while I watched the sun climb higher through the windshield. The road that day was the kind that feels endless. No traffic lights. No signs of life except for the faint shimmer of heat rising from the asphalt. Every few miles there'd be an old sign bleached almost white, or a weathered fence leaning at an angle. I'd driven that route dozens of times before, enough to know its strange rhythm. It was mostly straight but had sections that twisted unpredictably, following the contour of an old dry wash or the edge of a basin that filled with water maybe once every decade. If you weren't paying attention, the turns could surprise you. I'd been talking to my wife for maybe an hour when I noticed a motorcycle up ahead. It was just a dark speck at first, then gradually took shape, sleek black, low to the ground, a single rider tucked in tight. I guessed he was maybe half a mile ahead. He was moving fast, probably 70, maybe 80 miles an hour, and the way he leaned into the slight dips and curves made it look like he knew the road well. I watched him for a while, keeping a steady pace, half listening to my wife talk about errands and weekend plans. I remember laughing at something she said, but my attention kept drifting back to that motorcycle. Out there in the desert, it was the only thing moving besides me. The road began to shift slightly, bending with the outline of the old wash. It wasn't much of a curve, nothing sharp, but it had that subtle slope that tricks your eyes into thinking it's straighter than it really is. I'd taken that turn before. I knew it tightened suddenly near the end, posted for 45 miles an hour. The rider ahead didn't seem to slow down. His brake light never flashed. He was still going fast, maybe even faster than before. I remember thinking, this guy must really know the road if he's taking that turn at that speed. Then, in an instant, it went wrong. I saw him drift slightly wide as the curve tightened. The front wheel wobbled, just a twitch, like he'd realized too late that he was going too fast. And then, without any hesitation, the bike shot straight through the guardless edge of the turn. It was so sudden, so clean, it almost didn't look real. One moment he was there, and the next both he and the motorcycle just launched into the air over the edge. I saw the flash of chrome, the tilt of his helmet, and then they disappeared below the rise. I made a sound I can't really describe, something between a groan and a shout. My wife was still on the line mid-sentence, but I couldn't even process what she was saying. I fumbled with the phone and hung up without a word. My hands were already moving before I'd fully registered it. I pulled over onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, the truck shuddering to a stop. The air outside was dead quiet except for the ticking of the engine and the faint hiss of wind. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, and told them there had been a crash. My voice was shaking, but the dispatcher's tone was calm and steady, asking questions. Location, how far off the road, whether the person was moving. I shoved the phone in my pocket, still connected, and went around to the bed of the truck. My trauma kit was behind the seat. I grabbed it, tore open the pouch, slipped on gloves, and started walking toward the edge of the curve. The air smelled like hot dust and gasoline. I could see faint skid marks leading off the asphalt, then a break in the low brush where the motorcycle had gone through. When I reached the edge, I looked down, expecting the worst. The drop wasn't sheer, but it was steep, maybe 15 feet down into a slope of sand, rock, and scrub. The sage and creosote were scattered like tufts of gray-green. The light was bright enough that I had to squint, and for a second all I saw was twisted metal. What was left of the bike. Pieces of it were scattered in a rough line, black and silver fragments glinting in the sun. I scanned the area, heart pounding, expecting to see a body tangled in the brush, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. About 75 feet ahead, at the bottom of the slope, a figure was standing, or trying to. He was hunched over, arms braced on his knees, head hanging low. I couldn't believe it. He was on his feet. The man I just watched fly off the road at 80 miles an hour was standing there in the sand. I started moving toward him, careful on the loose ground. The dispatcher was still talking in my ear, asking questions, but I could barely focus on her voice. The slope was uneven, with chunks of rock that shifted under my boots. I shouted that I had eyes on the rider and that he was alive. I kept expecting him to collapse or cry out, but he didn't. When I got closer, maybe 20 feet away, I saw that his helmet had come off and was lying nearby, cracked along the side. His face was scraped and dusty, but his eyes were open, glassy and stunned. I told him to stay still and knelt beside him. My training kicked in automatically. Check airway, breathing, circulation. He was breathing fine. His pulse was steady, but his right shoulder was at a strange angle. Collarbone, I thought. His jacket was torn across the back, and there were streaks of dirt across his arms, but no obvious bleeding. His pupils were reactive, though he seemed dazed. Concussion, probably mild. He was lucky. Unbelievably lucky. The dispatcher asked me to keep him talking, to make sure he didn't lose consciousness. I looked back toward the wreck. The motorcycle had landed about 30 feet from where he'd come to rest. The front wheel was folded under, the frame twisted. I could smell fuel and something burnt, that acrid scent of scorched plastic and hot metal cooling in the sun. A single mirror had lodged itself upright in the sand, reflecting a blinding shard of sunlight. The whole scene was quiet except for the wind and the faint crackle of cooling metal. I stayed with him until the sirens arrived. Out there, response times are long. Desert roads stretch far between towns. But the sound eventually reached me, distant at first, and then growing louder. When the first sheriff's vehicle came into view, I waved them down, pointing to the break in the brush. Within minutes, paramedics were climbing down with their gear, assessing the situation, asking me questions. They were surprised too. One of them said something like, "He shouldn't even be conscious after that kind of fall." They worked efficiently, getting him on a stretcher, fitting a neck brace, checking his vitals again. The sheriff took my statement while they loaded him up. I explained what I'd seen, how fast he'd been going, how he'd missed the curve. The officer nodded, jotting notes in a small pad, occasionally glancing toward the crumpled bike being winched onto a flatbed. When the ambulance finally pulled away, I was left standing there beside my truck, the wind carrying a faint taste of dust and oil. The curve looked harmless from up close, just a simple bend in the road, but I couldn't stop staring at it, imagining that split second when everything went wrong. For a long time after that, I couldn't shake the image. The way the motorcycle had launched into the air, the silence after it vanished, the certainty I'd felt, that absolute gut-deep certainty that I'd just watched someone die. It had been so clear, so final in my mind. That's what stuck with me more than anything. The realization that sometimes, in the span of a heartbeat, your brain can decide something's over when it isn't. I sat back in my truck for a while after they left, my hands still trembling a little. I called my wife back and told her what happened, though my voice was strange, detached, like I was telling someone else's story. She asked if I was okay. I said I was, but I wasn't sure I believed it. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving a hollow, exhausted feeling in its place. The drive after that felt different. Every curve, every dip in the road seemed sharper, more dangerous. I kept imagining how thin the line was between control and disaster. The desert stretched on, endless and quiet, the sun climbing higher until everything shimmered in the heat. I stopped once at a gas station near Barstow. washed the grit from my hands, and stood by the pump watching trucks rumble by. My gloves were still sitting on the passenger seat when I got back in. Later, when I finally reached the base, I parked and just sat there for a while before going inside. I remember looking out over the tarmac, the heat rising in waves, and feeling this strange mix of relief and unease. I kept thinking about that moment, the motorcycle flying off the road, the dust rising, and then, against all reason, the rider standing up. He ended up fine, I learned later. Broken collarbone, mild concussion, a few bruises. Nothing that wouldn't heal. The paramedics told me he'd been wearing good gear, that it probably saved his life. I thought about that a lot. How thin the difference can be between tragedy and survival. How one decision, slowing down, taking a curve just a little easier, can mean everything. Even now when I drive that route, I always slow down at that curve. There's still a faint scar on the shoulder where the brush was torn away, and sometimes I catch myself glancing down the slope, half expecting to see that twisted bike still lying there. The desert has a way of keeping things quiet, of swallowing up moments like that, and leaving nothing but wind and sun and the memory of what almost happened. But that day stayed with me, not because it was dramatic or unbelievable, but because it reminded me how fragile everything is. 1 second it looks like the end. The next you're standing up, covered in dust, blinking in disbelief at the fact that you're still breathing. And as strange as it sounds, that's what I remember most about that morning. Not the crash, not the wreck, not even the fear, but the sight of him standing there under that endless sky, alive in a place where he shouldn't have been. It happened about 25 years ago, but even now when I think back on that night, it still feels strangely vivid, like something etched too deep to fade. My sister and I had been out late, driving back home from a small get-together at a friend's house. It wasn't far, maybe 20 or so miles, along a road that was usually busy during the day, full of commuters, trucks, gas stations, and the hum of late-night activity. But that night, it was dead silent, the kind of silence that feels unnatural when you're used to movement, sound, and light. The kind of silence that gets into your head and makes you start noticing things you'd normally ignore. It was past midnight, maybe closer to 1 in the morning. The radio was playing quietly, more as background noise to keep us both awake than anything else. My sister was driving. I was in the passenger seat, half turned toward the window, watching the rows of trees and open fields slide by. The air outside looked heavy and still, the sort of humid, pressing quiet you get in the summer after the heat's finally died down. The streetlights were far apart, so big stretches of the road were just swallowed in darkness, broken only by the headlights of our car carving a path through the black. We'd just come around a long bend when I noticed something ahead of us. Something dark lying on the road. It wasn't big, just a small black shape that looked like it was being pushed slightly by the breeze. It flapped a little, catching the headlights each time we dipped slightly in the road. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. At first I thought it was just a garbage bag. People used to toss them out sometimes, and they'd end up caught in the road, half flattened and full of air. It really did look like one, crumpled, light, and moving just enough to look alive in that faint, shifting way that trash sometimes does at night. We kept driving closer, and I remember saying something like, "What's that?" My sister didn't take her eyes off the road, but said it looked like a black plastic bag too. It was lying right in the center of our lane, so she slowed down a little, not wanting to run over it in case there was something inside. The closer we got, the more the headlights lit it up, and I remember thinking how strange it was that it wasn't blowing away. There was definitely a light wind that night. You could see it moving the grass and the edges of my sister's hair through the open window. But that thing just stayed there, shifting slightly like it was waiting for us. Then, maybe 50 feet away, it changed. It's hard to describe, because it didn't happen suddenly, not like in movies where something just appears. It was more gradual, like our brains were catching up with what we were seeing and trying to reassemble it into something that made sense. The shape on the ground seemed to lift, not all at once, but piece by piece. First one part rose, then another, and it was like the shadows around it started gathering together. What had looked like a flat, crumpled bag a second ago began to rise into the shape of a person. It stretched upward, gaining height, mass, and detail until suddenly it was a man, just standing there in the middle of the road, holding onto a bicycle. We both froze. My sister had slowed down almost to a stop by then. The car's headlights were directly on him, and the image is something that never left me. The man was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, and he was holding his bike upright with one hand, the front wheel slightly turned toward us. He wasn't moving. He wasn't looking away either. His head was slightly tilted down, but you could tell he was aware of us. His clothes looked dark, almost blending into the shadows around him, except for the faint gleam of metal on the bike and the way the light hit his face just enough to show pale skin. For a second, I thought maybe he'd been in an accident, maybe hit by someone else earlier and dazed. That was the only thing that made any sense. But there was no car. No sign of damage, no debris, nothing on the road that suggested anything had happened. He was just there, completely still. My sister rolled the car a little closer until we were almost alongside him. I could see the details better then. His bike was old, like something from the 1970s. Thin tires, faded frame, worn-out handle grips. The man himself looked to be in his late 40s, maybe 50s, with short hair and a thin, weathered face. His eyes caught the light for a second and reflected it. Not like an animal's would, but just enough to look unsettling. He didn't wave us down. He didn't signal for help. He didn't even move his mouth. He just stood there, one hand on the handlebar, the other loosely at his side. We pulled up level with him and stopped. The car idled quietly. For a few seconds, none of us said anything. The sound of the engine seemed too loud in that silence. I kept watching him, trying to figure out what I was looking at. He looked real, completely real, but something about the whole thing felt wrong. Maybe it was because I had seen that shape lying flat just seconds earlier. Maybe it was because the road had been empty in both directions. Not a single car ahead or behind us. Not even distant headlights. Maybe it was the fact that he seemed entirely unaffected by our presence. Like he had just materialized there out of nowhere and didn't care that we'd seen him. My sister lowered her window a crack. The air that came in was cool and smelled faintly of rain and asphalt. She leaned a little forward, watching him from behind the glass. He didn't move. His face looked calm but blank, almost detached, as if he wasn't fully there. After a few seconds, she nodded slightly, rolled the window back up, and started driving again. I turned to look through the rearview mirror, expecting to see him watching us leave, but when I glanced back, I couldn't see anything. The road behind us was completely empty. Neither of us said a word for a while. It was like we were both trying to process what had just happened. My sister kept both hands tight on the wheel, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her expression unreadable. The road stretched out in front of us, dark and empty again, as though nothing had ever been there. The radio was still playing faintly, but I don't remember what song it was. It just blended into the hum of the car, and I remember my stomach feeling heavy, like I'd swallowed a stone. Eventually, I broke the silence and asked her if she'd seen what I saw. She said yes, she had seen it exactly the same way I did. That it had looked like a bag at first, that it turned into a man, that he'd been holding a bike and standing there like he didn't belong. We didn't try to make sense of it that night. We didn't even talk much after that. When we got home, we both went straight to bed, each probably assuming the other would bring it up the next day. But neither of us did. Not for a while, anyway. Weeks later, when we finally talked about it again, we both realized that there was no logical explanation that fit. There had been no driveways or houses nearby. That stretch of road ran between open farmland and patches of trees. The nearest town was miles away. If the man had been cycling, where was he coming from? Why would he be out there at that hour, on a bike with no lights in the middle of a 2-lane highway? And how could something that flat and shapeless suddenly stand up and turn into a person right before our eyes? We both went back over it, again and again, remembering every little detail. The road was dry. The wind was light. Visibility was clear. We weren't tired or drunk or anything like that. We were alert, completely sober, and the whole thing lasted long enough for us to know it wasn't some kind of trick of the light. We saw him, both of us did, and there was no way to explain how he got there. Over the years, I've tried to come up with some explanation. Maybe he was already standing there and we just didn't notice him until the last moment, and the headlights distorted what we saw. Maybe the movement of the shadows made it look like something was lying down. Maybe the bike was lying on its side and he was crouched behind it before standing up. But even when I try to reason it out, it never fully adds up. The transition wasn't sudden. It was gradual, deliberate almost, like it was happening right in front of us, and we were meant to see it. I remember that part the clearest. The way it changed shape slowly, naturally, until it wasn't a shape anymore. It was a man. I can still see it in my mind. The curve of his shoulders as he stood. The angle of the bike wheel turning slightly in the beam of our headlights. The faint glint of the metal spokes as if the world was completely still, except for him and us. It was too detailed to be imagined. Too solid to be anything else. After that night, we avoided that stretch of road whenever we could. There was no reason for it. Nothing had happened. Not really, but every time I drove past that area alone, I'd catch myself glancing at the edges of the headlights, half expecting to see something dark lying there again. It never happened. The road stayed empty, but it always felt heavier there, like something unseen hung over that particular spot. My sister and I still talk about it sometimes, usually when the conversation drifts to strange memories or old stories. Even now she says it exactly the same way every time. It looked like a garbage bag until it wasn't, and that's the truth of it. There was no scream, no chase, no crash or ghost or anything like that. Just that impossible transformation in the middle of a dark, silent road. Something ordinary that became something it shouldn't have been. Looking back, what unsettles me most isn't even what we saw. It's that the man never looked afraid, or confused, or even bothered that two people had pulled up and stopped next to him. He just existed, like he belonged to that road in a way we didn't understand. Like he had been there before we arrived and would still be there long after we left. Sometimes I think about that quiet nod he gave before we drove away. Just one small movement. Calm and steady, and how it seemed to close the moment completely. Like he was acknowledging that we'd seen something we weren't supposed to see. I don't know what we witnessed that night. I don't think I ever will. All I know is that it wasn't a dream, and it wasn't a trick. It was real. We both saw it, and 25 years later, when I drive down an empty road late at night, I still find myself scanning the pavement ahead, watching for something small and dark shifting in the headlights, waiting to rise. It was somewhere around 4 in the morning when I crossed the Colorado-New Mexico border. The highway was empty, just a thin gray ribbon cutting through miles of frost-coated nothing. I'd been driving all night, half asleep and stiff from sitting too long. The cab of my old Dodge truck filled with the low hum of the heater and the occasional rattle from the glove box every time I hit a bump. My fuel gauge had been flirting with empty for the last 30 miles, and the low fuel light had come on about 10 minutes earlier. I told myself I'd stop at the next town I saw, but the stretch I was on didn't seem to have any towns, just fields and fences and blackness pressing in from all sides. When I finally saw a cluster of lights in the distance, it felt like relief. It was faint, almost like a mirage at first. But as I got closer, I saw a sign leaning half off its post that read something like, "Welcome to San Miguel," or Santa Mira. I honestly can't remember. The paint was faded and cracked, half covered by frost. The place didn't even look like a real town. Just a few dark buildings huddled along the road. There were no streetlights, no traffic lights, not even a glowing window. Everything was just shadows and silence. The only thing alive in that place was a small gas station sitting at the corner of the main road, its flickering fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. The sign said gas and groceries in crooked red letters, and 2 of the bulbs were burned out. I didn't see any cars. No movement, no sound. Just the hum of the cold wind through the bare trees behind the building. It was eerie, but I was too tired and too close to running out of gas to care. When I pulled up beside the pump, the lights above me flickered once, casting the concrete pad in a pale blue glow. The pump looked ancient. Numbers behind yellowed glass, buttons that looked worn down to metal. I swiped my card and it actually worked, which surprised me. I stepped out into the cold and the air hit me like a slap. My breath hung white in front of me. The wind was dry and sharp, the kind that gets into your sleeves and stings your knuckles. As I stood there pumping gas, I noticed just how still everything was. Not a single other car on the road. No sound of insects. No dogs barking. It was like the town had been drained of life. My headlights were still on, catching bits of frost on the ground, and I remember thinking it looked like snow even though it hadn't snowed in weeks. I could see my own reflection faintly in the window of the convenience store. Hood up, hands in pockets, just another tired traveler trying to get through the night. And then, out of nowhere, I noticed movement. It wasn't much. Just something shifting in the dark beyond the far side of the building. At first, I thought it might have been a stray dog, or maybe the wind moving a trash bag. But as my eyes adjusted, I made out the shape of another vehicle. A low, black car parked near the back corner of the lot, tucked mostly into the shadows. It looked sleek, clean, and totally out of place in this forgotten little town. The kind of car that belonged in a city, not parked behind a gas station in the middle of nowhere at 4 a.m. My first reaction was confusion. I hadn't seen another set of headlights for hours. Whoever was there must have been parked with their engine off and lights out the whole time. I squinted, trying to see through the tint on the windows, but they were completely blacked out, like mirror glass that gave away nothing. Then I realized there were people standing beside it. 4 of them. They were leaning against the car like they'd been waiting there all night, their outlines sharp against the dull glow of the gas station lights. For a second, I thought maybe they were locals, maybe guys hanging out late drinking or working on a car. But then I saw their clothes. They were dressed like they'd stepped right out of some gangster movie. Black shorts, white tank tops, tall white socks pulled up to their knees. The kind of look you'd see in a city neighborhood in summer. Not out here in the freezing dark. The temperature had to be in the low 20s, and they were just standing there like it was a warm afternoon. Something about it made my stomach tighten. I laughed quietly to myself at first, partly because the sight was so weird, and partly because they startled the hell out of me. But then they started to move. One by one, they pushed off the car and began walking toward me. Not fast, not running, just slow and steady all at once. Their footsteps were silent against the pavement. As they came closer, I could see the light catch on their arms and necks. Full-sleeve tattoos, black ink patterns that ran down to their wrists and up their necks. Their faces were hard and blank, and they didn't say a word. That was the moment my instincts kicked in. I didn't even think. I dropped the gas pump right there, fuel still splashing out onto the concrete, and jumped into my truck. My hands were shaking so bad I almost missed the ignition. The moment the engine caught, I slammed the shifter into drive and floored it. The tires squealed and caught traction, the truck lurching forward so fast that the gas pump hose jerked and popped out behind me. In the rearview mirror, I saw the 4 of them stop and watch as I tore out of the lot. But before I could even get a quarter-mile down the road, a pair of headlights flared to life behind me. They'd gotten back in their car. I watched the light swing wide out of the gas station and then lock in on me, speeding up fast. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I knew damn well it wasn't good. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I pushed the truck harder. The highway ahead of me stretched empty in both directions. Nothing but open road and blackness. The only sound was the roar of the wind through the cracked window and the deep growl of my truck's engine. That old Dodge wasn't much to look at. Paint faded. A dent on the back bumper, muffler patched more than once. But under the hood was a Hemi I'd spent years tuning. She could move when she had to. The black car behind me was smaller and probably quicker off the line. But once I hit the open road, I had the advantage. At first, they were gaining on me. I could see the glow of their headlights getting bigger in the mirror, closer every second. The road was 2 lanes, straight as an arrow, no traffic anywhere. I pushed the speedometer past 90, then 100, the steering wheel vibrating under my hands. My breath fogged the windshield even with the heater going full blast. I felt the tires biting into the cold asphalt, the hum turning into a high-pitched whine. I kept my eyes glued to the mirror. The black car followed, weaving just slightly, maybe trying to rattle me. But at that speed, even a small mistake could send us both spinning into the ditch. I stayed steady, hands tight, eyes forward. Mile after mile of nothing but darkness and empty road. Finally, after what felt like forever, I noticed the lights behind me growing smaller. I didn't ease up right away. I just kept my foot down until they were tiny pinpricks in the distance. Then just like that, they vanished. No headlights, no taillights, no sign of them at all. I drove another 5 miles before I even dared to slow down. My hands were still shaking on the wheel, my throat dry as sandpaper. I kept glancing back, half expecting those lights to appear again, but they didn't. The road behind me stayed dark and empty. When I finally pulled off at a rest stop an hour later, I just sat there for a while with the engine idling, staring out into the empty lot. My pulse was still pounding, and it took a long time for that adrenaline to fade. At the time, I tried to laugh it off. I even told myself maybe they were just messing around. Maybe they recognized how spooked I got and decided to chase me for fun. I told myself it was nothing. But later, when I mentioned it to a friend of mine, a cop from Arizona, his reaction wiped that smile right off my face. He told me that area, right around the Colorado-New Mexico border, was a known route for drug runs. The smaller highways were sometimes used to avoid the main interstates and checkpoints. He said there had been reports of cartel groups and smugglers using those backroads, and that sometimes they'd stop at isolated gas stations to switch vehicles or refuel before crossing further south. It clicked in my head like a cold blade sliding into place. Those guys weren't just hanging out. They weren't locals. They were working. When I thought back on it, everything made sense. The tinted windows, the fancy car, the dead quiet town, the way they all moved in sync without a word. I realized that if I'd hesitated even 30 seconds longer, if I'd gone inside to pay, or taken a minute to check the oil, they could have boxed me in. There wasn't another soul around. Nobody would have heard or seen a thing. For days after that, I kept thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see those 4 silhouettes stepping into the light. I could feel that same rush of cold fear in my chest. And the part that stuck with me the most wasn't the chase or the speed or even the danger. It was the silence. They never said a single word, not one. Just stared and walked, like it was already decided what would happen next. I still drive that same route sometimes, though I make sure I've got a full tank before I hit that stretch. I've tried to find that town again, looked for it on maps, even checked satellite images, but nothing ever matches what I remember. Maybe I got the name wrong. Maybe the place was so small it didn't even show up anymore. But every now and then, when I'm passing through that part of the border late at night, I get that same uneasy feeling creeping in. I slow down a little, glance out at the empty fields, the dark shapes of barns and fences. It's all the same quiet, the same cold. And sometimes in the far-off distance, I swear I catch the glint of headlights parked somewhere off the road, just sitting there, waiting. I don't stop anymore. I just keep driving. We'd spent the whole day loading that trailer. It was one of those exhausting, all-body days where every muscle feels stretched and tight by the time you finally sit down. My young wife and I were moving between cities, packing everything we owned into a 16-foot trailer that I'd borrowed from a friend. By the time we got the last box in and latched the door shut, the sun was already low, just brushing the horizon. The plan had been to leave early, get a good chunk of driving done before dark. But plans always go differently when you're moving. There's always one more thing to wrap, one more thing to carry, one more screw to tighten. The pickup I'd borrowed was an older heavy-duty model, one of those big, long trucks meant for hauling livestock or machinery. It was powerful, but the trailer was loaded to the brim with furniture, boxes, tools, and everything else from our little rental. It felt like pulling a house behind us. Every bump in the road, I could feel it tug on the hitch. The truck strained a bit each time I accelerated, but it was steady. I'd done enough driving with heavy trailers to know it just required patience and careful braking. The weight behind us made stopping a whole process. It wasn't something that could happen quickly. We finally pulled out of town just before dark. The air had that quiet coolness that comes at the end of a long summer day, when the heat finally lets go of the pavement. My wife dozed off not long after we got onto the highway. She'd worked just as hard as I had that day, maybe harder. She was curled up on the seat beside me, wrapped in her sweatshirt, face turned toward the window. Once the last bit of town faded behind us, the road opened up into nothing. It was one of those long two-lane highways that cuts across the state, mostly empty, except for the occasional pair of headlights in the opposite lane. On either side were cornfields and shelter belts, dark walls of trees and brush that caught the wind and swayed like they were whispering to each other. There were long stretches where there wasn't a single house light to be seen. No sign of anything man-made besides the strip of asphalt running straight ahead. I had the cruise control set somewhere around 65. The hum of the tires and the low rumble of the engine were steady, almost hypnotic. The radio was playing low, just enough to keep me company. Every once in a while, a truck would pass going the other way, and the blast of air would make the trailer sway a little before settling again. It was quiet, predictable driving, the kind that makes you start to relax a little too much if you're not careful. Around midnight, I remember noticing how the stars looked like they were sitting right on the edge of the fields. There was no light pollution out there, just the sharp outlines of constellations and that faint, milky haze across the sky. The road was empty, nothing ahead but darkness and the reach of my headlights. Wasn't tired exactly, but my eyes felt heavy from staring at the same stretch of black for so long. That's when I saw movement up ahead. At first it was just a flicker in my peripheral vision, something stepping out from the side of the road. My immediate thought was deer. They're everywhere out here, especially at night, and it's common to see a couple of them standing near the shoulder or wandering across the highway. I eased off the gas a little and tapped the horn. Just a quick warning blast. Usually that's enough to make them bolt back into the field, but they didn't move. The headlights reached further, and I realized there were two of them. Still assuming deer, I slowed a bit more and leaned forward to get a better look. But the shapes weren't right. Too upright, too still. Another second passed, and I saw what I was really looking at. Two men. They were standing in the middle of the road, one in my lane, one in the oncoming lane, about 200 yards ahead. My brain tried to make sense of it while my foot instinctively pressed harder on the brake. Out here, at this hour, there was no reason for anyone to be walking, let alone standing dead center in the road. The truck was heavy and slow to respond. Even as I eased onto the brakes, I could feel the trailer pushing forward, that sluggish weight pressing against me. The headlights washed over the two figures more clearly as I got closer. They weren't wearing anything reflective, just dark clothes. They didn't wave, didn't signal for help, didn't move at all. They were just standing there, shoulder to shoulder across both lanes. I leaned on the horn, one long, desperate blast that shattered the quiet. The sound rolled out across the fields, echoing back faintly. Still, they didn't move. At that moment, I realized I wasn't going to be able to stop. Not in time. The truck and trailer together had to weigh close to 10 tons. I was already fighting to slow it down without locking the brakes and losing control. If I slammed on them too hard, the trailer could jackknife, and that would be the end of it. My pulse started pounding in my ears. I was yelling, but there was no one awake to hear me. The truck roared as I tried to downshift, hoping the engine brake would help slow us. The tires screeched on the pavement. That high, terrible sound that means you're at the edge of losing traction. The men still didn't move. They just stood there facing the truck like they were daring me to hit them. At that point, there were only seconds left. Maybe 5, maybe 8. Everything in me was locked on survival instinct. The distance was closing fast, and I knew there was no way to come to a complete stop. I tried to steer for the narrow gap between them, aiming the center of the hood directly between their silhouettes. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. At the very last second, the man standing in my lane jumped sideways, throwing himself clear. I caught a split-second glimpse of his face as the truck roared past, just enough to see his eyes wide and his mouth open. He was so close I thought the mirror might clip him. I swear I could have reached out the window and touched him. The trailer lurched behind me, swaying violently from the sudden shift. I fought the steering wheel, trying to keep it straight. The horn was still blaring, the tires screaming. Then in a rush of motion and sound, they were gone. The road stretched out empty again. Nothing but darkness ahead and behind. I didn't slow down any further. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it might burst. The inside of the truck was filled with the smell of hot brakes and rubber. I realized I'd been holding my breath and finally let it out in a long, shaky exhale. For a few moments I thought about stopping. Maybe they were in trouble. Maybe it was some kind of emergency. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. The way they'd stood there, the way they hadn't moved until the very last possible instant. It wasn't someone asking for help. It was someone trying to make me stop. Out here in the middle of nowhere, that meant only one thing. They were up to no good. There wasn't another set of headlights anywhere on that stretch of highway. No houses, no stores, nothing. Just miles and miles of empty road surrounded by cornfields and dark tree lines. I imagined what might have happened if I'd managed to stop in time. If I'd pulled over, maybe there would have been more of them waiting in the ditch. Maybe they wanted the truck, the trailer, everything we owned. Or maybe something worse. I didn't want to know. It wasn't until I looked over that I realized my wife wasn't on the seat anymore. She was groggily pulling herself up from the floorboard, disoriented. When I'd hit the brakes, she must have slid right off the seat. She looked up at me, confused, but I couldn't even form words. My hands were shaking too badly. I just kept driving. For miles, I stared at the dark stretch ahead, half expecting to see more figures in the road. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the scene. The way the headlights caught their faces, how close I'd come to hitting them, the way the second man had never even moved. Eventually, the highway started to curve toward the next town. I saw the faint orange glow of distant streetlights, and it felt like oxygen coming back into my lungs. When I finally reached a small gas station, I pulled in and just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring out through the windshield. The world felt oddly still. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bugs flickering around them. I could smell hot metal from the brakes, that acrid scent mixing with dust and the faint sweetness of the fields outside. My pulse was still racing, but slower now, settling into the kind of deep exhaustion that comes after a scare. It hit me then, how close it had been. Another few feet and I would have hit that man. There would have been nothing left to do but call the police, explain why I couldn't stop, why two strangers were standing in the middle of nowhere blocking the highway. It could have destroyed everything. I sat there until I felt steady enough to keep driving. When we finally got back on the road, I kept both hands on the wheel the whole time. My eyes flicked between the ditches and the rearview mirror constantly. Every shadow looked like a person standing there. We reached our new city, just as the first light of morning was spreading across the horizon. The trailer was covered in dust, the back window of the truck speckled with bugs and grime. My wife went inside to sleep right away, but I stayed outside a while longer, just standing there beside the truck. The metal was still warm from the long drive. I walked around the trailer once, checking the hitch, the tires, making sure everything was intact. Think I just needed something to do with my hands. Something solid to remind me it was over. For days afterward, I couldn't get the image out of my head. Two men standing side by side in the middle of an empty highway, illuminated in the headlights like they were carved out of the night. No car, no lights, no sign of where they came from or where they went. Just gone. Every time I drove on a dark stretch of road after that, My foot would ease up on the gas the moment I saw anything move ahead. Even a mailbox or a shadow could make my stomach tighten. It was like part of me was waiting for it to happen again. I never told anyone else about it. It didn't feel like the kind of story people would believe unless they'd seen it themselves. There was nothing supernatural about it, nothing mysterious that couldn't be explained. But it scared me in a way few things ever have, because it was real. Because I'd seen how close a few seconds can come to changing everything. That night reminded me that danger doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it just steps out into the road, waiting for you in the middle of nowhere, and you don't know what it wants until it's almost too late. Even now, years later, whenever I'm driving a quiet highway at night and the beams of the headlights stretch far ahead into the dark, I find myself gripping the wheel a little tighter. I can almost see them again, two figures standing in the center of the lane, staring straight into the lights, waiting, and every time I feel that same cold rush of fear crawl through my chest, the one that reminds me just how close I came to never making it home. I was 16 when I bought my first car, a faded red 1989 Mercury Capri convertible that I picked up for $600 from a guy who lived down the road. It was old, dented in a few places, and had more rust than paint in some spots, but to me, it was freedom, the kind of freedom that made a 16-year-old feel unstoppable. I didn't care that the top leaked when it rained, or that the engine coughed like a smoker every time I started it. I'd saved up all summer mowing lawns and helping my uncle at his shop to buy that car, and I loved it. That convertible became my escape from everything. Whenever things got too loud at home or I just needed to think, I'd take it out on the back roads that stretched across the countryside around our town in Missouri. Those roads were mostly gravel, winding through rolling hills, cornfields, and patches of thick trees that seemed to close in on you at night. The kind of roads where you could drive for miles without seeing another pair of headlights. I'd take the top down, even when it was chilly. Something about the air out there, the smell of grass, dirt, and faint whiffs of cow manure from distant farms, felt pure. I'd put on a sweatshirt, crank up the old radio that barely caught any stations, and just drive. It was my little piece of peace in a world that didn't have much of it. One night, late in the summer, I decided to take the long way home. It was one of those perfect evenings, clear sky, a big bright moon, and the kind of stillness that makes the world feel paused. It must have been around 11 or so. The air had cooled off, and the crickets were out, filling the silence with their steady rhythm. I was coming back from a friend's place, taking the back roads that wound between the old farmsteads. I remember the feeling of the wind against my face, the hum of the tires on the road, and the faint smell of hay drifting through the air. The further I drove, the darker it got. Those Missouri back roads don't have streetlights, and once you leave the last porch light of town behind, the night feels thick, like it's pressing in around you. My headlights barely reached 20 feet ahead, and beyond that was nothing but black. But I didn't mind it. I liked that feeling of being alone out there. I remember thinking it felt peaceful. Just me, the road, the stars above. I turned onto a narrow stretch that cut through an area locals called the Low Road, where the trees grew close enough that their branches reached out over the road like a tunnel. In the daylight it was pretty, almost scenic, but at night it felt different. The darkness under those trees was deeper, heavier. My headlights caught glimpses of the tree trunks on either side, flashes of bark, and sometimes the glint of eyes from raccoons or opossums watching from the brush. As I drove under the thickest part of the canopy, something brushed across the back of my head, just barely, like a piece of a branch or a handful of leaves. I ducked instinctively, thinking it was just that, a low branch. I laughed a little to myself, more startled than anything. But then, just as I sat upright again, I heard a sound. It wasn't loud, just a sharp, wet slap, like something heavy hitting vinyl, came from behind me somewhere in the back seat. At first, I didn't even register what it could be. I just froze, hands locked on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The noise didn't repeat. There was only the wind rushing past the car, the hum of the tires, and my heart thudding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just something falling from the trees, maybe a big branch or a wad of leaves that had bounced into the car. I told myself not to freak out, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned my head just slightly, glancing over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. At first, I didn't even understand what I was looking at. The light from the dashboard barely reached the back seat, but there was movement. Something black, long, and shifting. It took a few seconds for my brain to make sense of it. A snake. A huge black snake. It was half coiled on the seat, the rest of its body thrashing, sliding over the cracked vinyl, trying to find somewhere to go. Its scales caught little bits of light as it twisted, and the motion was so fast and frantic that my stomach dropped. I could see its tail whipping back and forth, the body sliding toward the floorboard, toward the gap under my seat. That's when the panic hit. I screamed. Loud. I don't even remember what sound came out of me. Something between a shout and a gasp. My foot slammed on the brake without thinking, and the car jerked so hard I nearly lost control. Gravel scattered under the tires as I swerved onto the shoulder, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The snake disappeared under my seat before the car even stopped moving. I felt it. The faintest brush against the back of my calf, or maybe I imagined it. But the thought of that thing under me made every hair on my body stand on end. I threw the car into park and practically jumped out before it had fully stopped, stumbling onto the gravel road, my legs shaking so bad I could barely stand. I backed away from the car, staring at it like it was alive. My headlights shone across the empty road, the tops of the trees swaying just slightly in the breeze. The night was dead quiet again. No cars, no voices, just the sound of insects and my own ragged breathing. I stood there, frozen, afraid to even look inside. It took me a minute before I could move. My hands were trembling as I walked slowly around the car, keeping my distance. The top was still down, the interior lit dimly by the dash lights. I could see the back seat, empty now, but I knew it was there. I'd seen it. Every time I tried to get close, my body tensed up again. I've never liked snakes. Even the harmless ones make my skin crawl. But this one was huge. It had to be at least 5 feet long, maybe more. And now it was somewhere inside my car. I started pacing on the gravel shoulder, running both hands through my hair, trying to think. I didn't have any tools, no flashlight, nothing to scare it out. The nearest house was probably 2 or 3 miles away. I could walk it, sure, but leaving the car out here in the middle of nowhere didn't feel right either. Finally, I grabbed my phone from my pocket and called my dad. I could barely speak straight, my voice shaking, tripping over words. He probably thought I'd hit a deer or wrecked. I just kept saying there was a snake in the car, that it was huge and I wasn't getting back in. He told me to stay put, that he'd be there soon. So I waited, standing there in the dark with the crickets and cicadas buzzing around me. I couldn't stop picturing that thing moving under the seat. I kept thinking I'd see it crawl out, maybe slither across the hood, maybe vanish into the night. Every tiny sound made me jump. A leaf falling, a frog croaking, a twig snapping in the trees. After what felt like forever, I saw headlights in the distance, my dad's old Ford pickup rumbling down the road. Relief washed over me the second he pulled up. I waved him down like a man stranded in the desert. When he got out, he looked at me confused, then at the car. I didn't even go near it. I just pointed. He shook his head a little, grabbed a flashlight from the truck and walked over. I stayed back maybe 20 feet away, heart still racing. It took him a while to find it. He checked under the seats, under the dash, even inside the trunk. Then after a few minutes, he whistled softly and said he saw it. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I walked a little closer, just enough to see the beam of his flashlight catch movement under the driver's seat. The snake was coiled tight against the metal rails, motionless now, probably terrified after all the chaos. He used a long stick he found in the ditch to nudge it out. careful and calm like he'd done it 100 times before. Eventually, it slid out from under the seat, black and glossy in the light, its tongue flicking in and out. It wasn't aggressive, just scared. Once it was fully out, it tried to slither off into the grass on the side of the road. Dad let it go, watching until it disappeared into the weeds. He told me it was just a black rat snake. Harmless, good for eating mice. Probably fell from one of the low branches when I drove under the trees. It made sense, but that didn't make me feel any better. The idea of it being in my car, inches from my legs while I was driving, made my stomach twist. I remember standing there for a long time after it was gone, staring at the open car with the flashlight still shining across the seat. I checked every inch, under the seats, behind them, even under the floor mats. Every shadow looked like it could be another snake. When I finally got back in, I couldn't stop shaking. My dad followed me home just in case, but the whole drive, I kept my feet pulled up slightly, afraid to rest them on the floor. Every bump in the road made me flinch. When I got home, I parked the car in the driveway and left the top up for the first time in months. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing twisting in the back seat. Felt the faint touch of it brushing against my leg. The next morning, I went out and checked again, just to be sure. There was no sign of it, no movement, no trace, nothing. But I couldn't shake the unease. From that night on, I never drove those back roads with the top down again. Not once. It wasn't just about the snake. It was the realization of how fast something can turn from peaceful to terrifying. One second I was enjoying the quiet night, feeling free and alive. And the next, I was inches away from wrecking because of a creature that didn't even mean me harm. For years after that, I'd still think about it every time I saw a shadow move near the car. Every rustle of a leaf, every brush of a branch across the windshield made me tense up. It took a long time for that feeling to fade, and even now, all these years later, I can still picture the way that snake looked under the dim light. Long, black and alive. The way it disappeared beneath my seat like it belonged there. That night taught me something simple but lasting. Peace out there in the dark is only peaceful until something alive shares it with you. It happened when I was 20 years old. My car was still pretty new then, about a year and a half old. A silver sedan that I'd bought used but took good care of. It had always run perfectly. Smooth acceleration, no odd noises, no warning lights, nothing. I drove it every day to work. About a 30-minute commute each way, mostly through city streets and a few stretches of open boulevard. I usually worked late shifts, so I got used to driving home around midnight when most people were asleep and the streets were quiet. I liked it that way. No traffic, no noise, just the hum of my tires against the pavement and the low, steady rhythm of my engine. It felt peaceful, predictable. I had no reason to think that night would be any different. I remember it clearly. It was early fall, one of those nights where the air is cool but not cold, and the windows start to fog if you leave them rolled up too long. I had just clocked out after a long shift, tired but relaxed. Ready to get home, maybe make something to eat, then crash in bed. The streets were empty as I left the parking lot. Streetlights cast long orange streaks across the road, and the sound of my tires over the asphalt echoed faintly between the houses. I turned onto the main boulevard that cut through the neighborhood, a 4-lane road divided by a low cement median filled with plants and small shrubs. During the day, it looked kind of nice. Someone kept it trimmed, with little bushes spaced evenly down the middle. But at night, it was just a dark strip that broke up the streetlights, leaving patches of shadow where you couldn't see much past the divider. There weren't many cars out. Once in a while, one would pass going the opposite direction, their headlights washing across the divider for a second before fading into the distance. I kept my radio low, more for the background noise than anything. I was halfway through town, maybe 10 minutes from home. I remember thinking about how empty everything looked. The houses dark, driveways empty, the occasional porch light glowing faintly in front of someone's door. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel both calm and uneasy at the same time. Safe because there's no one around, but nervous because there's no one around if something does go wrong. I came up to a large intersection, the kind with turning lanes and a long light cycle. It was red when I got there, so I slowed to a stop. I could see the yellow glow of another streetlight down the road ahead, but otherwise, it was just me sitting alone under the red light. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, half paying attention, half lost in thought. When the light finally turned green, I pressed down on the gas and started moving through the intersection. That's when it happened. Halfway across the intersection, the engine died. No sputtering, no jerking, just a sudden complete silence. My foot was still on the gas pedal, but nothing responded. The dashboard lights flickered, and the sound of the engine vanished completely. It was as if someone had cut the power. My heart jumped immediately. It was such a sharp, unnatural change that for a split second, I thought maybe I had hit something, or the car had shut off by mistake. I remember that eerie silence so clearly. The hum of the road stopped. The air conditioner went quiet. Even the radio went dead. It was like the world had muted itself. I coasted forward a few feet, rolling to a stop right in the middle of the intersection. The first thing I did was glance around for other cars. At that time of night, you don't expect anyone, but there's always that brief panic. What if someone's coming up fast behind me? The street was empty, though. No headlights in the distance, no cars from the side streets, nothing. Just the low glow of the streetlights and my dead car sitting there in the middle of the road. I took a breath, put the car in park and turned the key. It started right away. No hesitation, no grinding, no delay. The dashboard lit up normally. The engine came to life smoothly, like nothing had happened. I remember blinking at it, confused, waiting for a check engine light or something to explain it. But everything looked fine. Every gauge was normal. It was like the stall had never happened. I was just starting to think about pulling back onto the road when something caught my attention. Headlights. I looked up, and for a split second I didn't understand what I was seeing. There were headlights coming straight at me, not from the opposite side of the boulevard where they should have been, but directly in my lane, aimed right at the front of my car. At first, I thought it must have been some kind of reflection, maybe a car turning ahead or lights bouncing off a window, but they were getting brighter, fast. My eyes adjusted, and I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that a car had turned from a side street onto the boulevard, and instead of crossing over the median to the proper lanes, they had turned directly into the lane I was sitting in. My lane. They were driving the wrong way. The car was coming fast, its headlights high and blinding. I could see it clearly now. An older sedan, dark color, maybe navy or black. The driver must have thought the boulevard was a two-lane road and had turned left without realizing there was a divider separating the directions. They were accelerating toward me head-on. For a moment I froze. My brain tried to catch up with what I was seeing. If my car hadn't stalled, I would have been halfway down the road already, right in their path. We would have collided headfirst, probably at full speed. The realization hit me like a wave, the kind that leaves you dizzy and hollow inside. The other car swerved suddenly, jerking to the side. Its tires screeched against the pavement, and it jumped up over the median before disappearing down the correct side of the boulevard. The entire thing lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then the road was empty again, as if nothing had happened. I just sat there gripping the steering wheel. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. The sound of the engine idling suddenly felt too loud, almost like it was mocking the silence that had come before. My hands were shaking. I didn't move for a long moment, just stared down the road where the other car had gone. If the stall hadn't happened at the exact moment it did, I would have been right in that driver's path. There was no room to dodge, no divider wide enough to swerve behind. It would have been a direct, full-speed collision. Eventually, I took a shaky breath, put the car back in drive, and eased through the rest of the intersection. I drove the rest of the way home slower than usual, barely touching the gas. Every time I looked at the road ahead, I imagined that car coming out of nowhere again, headlights blinding me before everything went black. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I just sat there for a while, engine running, staring at the steering wheel. I tried to convince myself it was just a weird coincidence, that the stall had been a random fluke, and that I'd just been lucky. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. That car had never stalled before. Not once. I bought it new from a dealer about 1.5 years before. It was reliable, consistent. I did all the oil changes on time, rotated the tires, checked the fluids. I drove that car another 5 years after that night, through winters, storms, long road trips, and thousands of commutes. It never stalled again. Not once. Sometimes even now, I think about how narrow that margin was. How 1 second either way could have been the difference between me sitting safely at home that night and a twisted wreck in the middle of the road. I replay it in my head sometimes, wondering what exactly made the engine die like that. I even had it checked not long after. Took it to the same mechanic I always went to. They ran diagnostics, checked the battery, alternator, fuel pump, everything. They said the car was fine, better than fine actually. No sign of any electrical issue, no fault codes, no reason it should have just shut off like that. I remember the mechanic handing me the keys back, shrugging. Probably just a fluke, he said. But that word stuck with me, a fluke. Something that wasn't supposed to happen but did just once. For no clear reason. It was hard not to feel like something. Chance. Luck, fate, whatever word you want to use, had stepped in right then. In that 1 second between acceleration and impact. I've driven that intersection hundreds of times since then, and every single time, I glance left, then right, then left again before going through, even when the light's green and the road's empty. That night changed the way I drive, made me realize how fragile everything can be, how one random, unexplained moment can stand between an ordinary night and something irreversible. When I think back to it now, what sticks with me most isn't the fear I felt in that moment, but the silence that came right before, the kind of silence that feels almost alive, like the world holding its breath for just a second. Then the engine came back, the headlights came, and my life, for whatever reason, was spared by a dead car that never died again. I was 19, driving home from my boyfriend's house after spending most of the evening there. It was late, close to 2 in the morning, and the roads were completely empty. That time of night always felt strange, like the world went quiet and hollow. The radio was barely audible, just low background noise to fill the silence, and my headlights stretched far ahead on the road, cutting through patches of mist that clung low to the ground. The air outside looked heavy, cold, and still. The route home wasn't long, maybe 15 minutes, but it always felt longer at night. The first part wound through the last few streets of town. Neighborhoods, streetlights, small gas stations. Then, almost suddenly, the town ended, and everything turned to open land. On one side were endless cornfields, the kind that stood tall and dark even when the moonlight hit them. On the other side, a line of trees formed a shelter belt that followed the road for miles. It was that strange border where civilization stopped and the country began. The stoplight at the edge of town was the last one before the highway turned rural. During the day, it was nothing special, just a light that everyone rolled through without thinking. But at night, it looked completely different. It was surrounded by open space, and the light from it pooled on the asphalt in a lonely red glow. When I pulled up to it, I could see the reflection of my headlights bounce off the metal poles, and the faint shimmer of frost beginning to form on the ground. I stopped fully, even though there wasn't another car in sight. My car idled quietly, the dashboard lights faintly glowing blue and green. The air conditioning hummed, and I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel out of habit. The road stretched out ahead, completely empty. Just a straight line disappearing into darkness. Behind me, the town lights flickered faintly. Street lights, neon signs from closed stores. The glow of a 24-hour gas station far off. In front of me, there was nothing but cornfields and the black outline of the trees. I remember glancing at the clock on my dashboard. It said 2:07 a.m. I was tired, the kind of tired where your eyes burn a little and your body feels slow. I thought about how my mom hated when I drove home that late, but I always brushed it off. Nothing ever happened in that town. Nothing ever happened on that road. Out of nowhere, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, something quick and low off to the right. My first thought was that it had to be a deer. It wasn't unusual to see them out there, especially near the cornfields. I turned my head to the right, expecting to see a shape darting into the field. But what I saw wasn't a deer. There was a man standing just outside the reach of my headlights, maybe 15 or 20 feet away from my car, on the shoulder of the road. At first, I didn't even register what I was looking at. It was so out of place. He wasn't walking down the road or trying to cross it. He was facing me. He looked like he was in his 50s. His clothes were dark, but I could tell they were dirty, maybe worn down, like old work pants and a jacket that hung loose on his frame. His hair looked unkempt, messy, almost greasy under the faint light. He wasn't wearing anything that made sense for the cold, damp night. What really caught me, though, was that he wasn't just standing there. He was creeping forward, slowly, step by step toward my car. The second he realized I was looking at him, he froze completely. We just stared at each other for what felt like a full minute, though it was probably only a few seconds. His expression didn't change. His eyes were fixed on mine, wide and blank. My stomach dropped. There was something wrong about the way he stood, the way his shoulders hunched forward slightly, like he'd been mid-step and didn't expect to be caught. Then I noticed his right hand. He was holding something long and metallic, just barely visible in the light. At first I thought it might be a crowbar or a wrench, but as he shifted slightly, I saw the curved end and realized it was a tire iron. I don't think I even thought in words at that point. My body just reacted. My heart started pounding so fast it hurt. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Every instinct I had screamed to move. I didn't even look up at the light. It was still red, but I slammed my foot on the gas anyway. The tires screeched as I shot forward, my headlights flashing over his face for a split second as I passed. I saw him flinch and take a step back, his face twisting, and then he disappeared into the darkness as my car sped down the road. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My hands were gripping the wheel so tight they hurt. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to steady my breathing, but my chest felt like it was being crushed. The empty fields on either side of me blurred past. The speedometer climbed 50, 60, 70, and I didn't care. Every few seconds I glanced into the rearview mirror, even though I couldn't see anything but blackness. I kept expecting to see headlights behind me or a shape on the road, but there was nothing. The next intersection came up fast, the turn that would take me onto the smaller road toward home. I almost missed it. I slowed just enough to make the turn, my tires kicking up gravel as I swung onto it. The road narrowed and dipped between patches of trees, and I realized how far out of town I already was. I drove the rest of the way home with my pulse pounding in my ears. Every time I passed a dark patch or a row of trees, I half expected someone to step out. When I finally reached my driveway, I didn't pull in right away. I sat there for a minute with the engine running, staring at the front porch light of my house. It felt wrong to turn the car off, like it was the only thing keeping me safe. When I finally did shut it off, the silence hit me hard. My hands were still trembling. I sat there, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The night around me was quiet again, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made it hard to tell if the noise in your ears was from outside or just your own heartbeat. I eventually went inside, locked every door, and double-checked the windows before I went to bed. I didn't tell anyone that night. I didn't even tell my boyfriend. I just couldn't find the words to explain how real that fear was, how close he'd been. The next morning, I left for work earlier than usual. I took the same route, though I almost turned around twice. When I reached that same intersection, daylight made it look harmless again. The light was green this time, and I didn't even have to stop. But as I passed, I noticed something near the ditch, a set of footprints in the soft dirt by the side of the road. They led from the field up toward the shoulder, right where he'd been standing, and then back again toward the corn. There were a few tire tracks too, faint but fresh, like a car or truck had been pulled off the road for a while. I slowed down, heart thudding again, and kept driving. I couldn't shake the thought that he hadn't just been out there walking. He'd been waiting, maybe for anyone who stopped long enough at that red light. For a few weeks, I avoided that route entirely. I'd take the long way home, staying in town longer before cutting through side streets to the highway. But one night, about a month later, I couldn't avoid it. I was coming home late again, around midnight this time, and the detour road was closed for repairs. I had to go the same way. When I reached that same light, my stomach twisted. I slowed down but didn't stop. I glanced to the right, half expecting to see someone again, but there was nothing. Just the same open fields and trees. I passed through the intersection without waiting for the light to change. A few days after that, I heard from a coworker that someone had been arrested not far from there, a man in his 50s who'd been caught trying to break into a parked car on a farm road. They said he was living out of an old pickup, sleeping in fields and stealing gas and tools from nearby sheds. I never knew for sure if it was the same man, but the description matched almost perfectly. The same age, the same kind of clothes. I didn't feel relieved, though. I just felt sick. Because if it was him, that meant I'd come face to face with someone who wasn't just out for a walk in the middle of the night. He'd been holding that tire iron for a reason, and I'd been sitting there alone, doors unlocked, headlights lighting up the perfect target. After that, I started locking my car doors the second I got in, no matter where I was. I never lingered at red lights if I was the only one around, and I always kept my eyes moving, checking mirrors, scanning the edges of the road. It's been years now, but even today, if I find myself stopped on an empty road at night, I still feel that same cold crawl up my spine. I can still see his eyes in the glare of my headlights, unblinking, startled, but not afraid. He froze because I caught him before he was ready, and every time I think about it, I realize how easily that night could have ended differently if I hadn't looked.